Uh, all right. So this week we've gone through these three major topics, and then we're going to talk about iteration two. We're going to talk about this for maybe 20 minutes. Um, Thankfully, it's it's actually less to talk about than iteration one in a way, um, which is good. So I'm just going to get that up. Project backend. So I believe I donkey vote. If really the answer is because people donkey voted, then I'm like dying. Um, oh, that's a great question. So here's what's happened. Here's what happens. 9 hours ago, yes, I merged in iteration two into your repos, I believe. Um, I think that's the case. I'm pretty sure it worked. So like these groups here, for instance, Wednesday 11 arrow. Oh, Taylor, what are the odds? What are the odds, Taylor? Nice to see you here. If I look at commits, yeah. So this is all like, so this was merged in 9 hours ago. I think they merge in automatically now. We've tried to get that happening, but if they don't, you'll have to check your merge request branch. Um, but yeah, so this you would have seen kind of appear in your repo. Um, Someone asked, so Savesha said, I accidentally merged the merge request for iteration two. So, did Taylor just merge it randomly at like, oh, that's not, anyway, ignore me. Um, what happens if you refuse the merge request? I don't know, you'll find it a bit difficult. Um, so, Savesha said, I've merged in the merge request from iteration 2 before my lab assessment. Will I be marked down for that? No, because the tutor will literally just go to your commits and they'll just like, they'll go to the last commit you made before the deadline and they'll just look at that. So it doesn't really matter that you merge it in, that you have problems merging it in. I think this is public. Let me, I don't know if we can make it public. It's okay. Anyway, it's in your group repo. I just want to talk through this a little bit because I know you all like a bit of a brief on assessments. Um, what has changed from iteration 1? I just want to emphasize that clearly. In iteration 1, we had this section 3 here, right? That's been removed because we finished iteration 1. In iteration 2, we have this whole new section, section 4, which describes iteration 2, and you can go and read that. Right? It's quite like, this is the iteration. This is the meat of this next 4 weeks. So section 4 is the big change. The other medium change is section 6. So we have updated the interface to include more data types, to include more interface methods, and one of the biggest things you'll notice is that suddenly we have URL routes instead of functions, and they have HTTP methods. But pretty much, like, in a large sense, most of the data types and most of the exceptions and descriptions are the same, right? I'm going to get the inevitable question, which is like, how do I find out what's changed? Well, I mean, I'm not going to give you a list, and I'm not going to give you a list for 2 reasons. One of the reasons is that, I mean, there's nothing sneaky here, right? It's not like you're going to like get 3 weeks in and be like, I didn't notice that change. Like, it's pretty obvious stuff. But A, you can look through the commit history, which is great practice, right? Because you can literally just go to the commits and see what's changed. But even better than that, I would strongly encourage that what every group does, is you what's the easiest way to articulate it? You go through and you each of you kind of read through this and you come together and you actually talk about what you think has, like, what's changed and what you're going to need to do about it. So there's a few more routes as well, and by a few more routes I mean there's like a lot more routes. The thing about iteration 2 is it's the big one. It's the big kahuna. It's like, it's where most of the work is. I mentioned that section 6 has changed a little bit. We've also added some sections in section 6 which I think include permissions, token, working with the front end, tagging users. There's some extra sections here that have been added to section 6, right? that should be easy enough. That's it. We've only changed section 4 and section 6. So you only really need to reread those two. Something that I would point your attention to is section 7 here about the due dates. So for iteration 1, here's the thing about iteration 1. For iteration 1, you all had 3 weeks to complete it. That started from the Monday of week 1. Most of you didn't settle into a group and get your Git repo and all that till like the end of week 1. So you kind of had 2.5 weeks to do it. Iteration 2, on the other hand, is due 4 weeks from today. 4 weeks. So you've nearly got twice the time for some groups. And also, you're also smarter than you were 3 weeks ago. That's for sure. Like in terms of the topics of this course. So it's a very manageable topic. In terms of lectures that relate to iteration 2, realistically, there's a little bit we do next week on 5.4 and 5.2 that you will want to use for the project, right? But these topics that we're covering next week realistically cover like less than 5% of iteration 2. So you shouldn't really feel like you're handicapped at all. The only two things you should feel like you aren't able to quite do yet, because we haven't talked about it, is you shouldn't really feel comfortable doing the 6.9 user session stuff, which is to do with tokens. And you probably aren't going to feel comfortable, or the token stuff, and you probably aren't going to feel super comfortable doing the persistence. Yeah. And this part here, section 4.4, which is the storing data. So section 4.4 and section 6.6 and 6.9, most of you would realistically not want to worry about for 7 days. But that's not going to stop you doing anything. There's tons to do. We have to work over Easter. I can make it due before Easter if you want. When is Easter? Is Easter in week... What is Easter? What's the date of Easter? I hope I didn't make this due on like a Easter Monday. Oh, you guys got lucky. I'm gonna have to move that back a day. Wait, we didn't have a lecture in week 8? Huh. Okay. That's not good. I didn't plan for that. Okay. Yeah, I mean that due date will have to get knocked back a day. So it's probably going to be due on like the Tuesday of Tuesday week 8. Though don't get too excited. Ah, oh, okay. Damn it. You win. You win, students. Ah, okay. You just make a note of that quickly. Due date 1531 project iteration 2 pushback 1 day. Right. Okay. Yeah. We don't have a lecture that day though. That's even more concerning. Oh god. We'll just probably cut a lecture out. I might just do this bonus lecture on that day. I might just record it and live stream it at the same time, because it's out of the scope of the course. Like, this lecture here is basically like, how do you build a front end in like 40 minutes? And it's not the, it's pretty light. So we might just do that one on the, yeah. Anyway, we'll sort that out later. Great. So anyway, back to the project. There's a lot to read through here. I can't and should not go through all of it with you, because this is an exercise in you going through it and understanding it with your teams. But some things I will flag firstly. You notice that instead of functions, you now have routes and HTTP methods. There is a really critical file. In fact, you can look at the merge request. You can probably actually look at the commit that was made here. The kind of, and maybe we'll just actually look at the commit. So the commit has a README in it which has been updated, but that's a huge diff. That's kind of unworkable to look at. We then updated the pylint RC file
by adding it, which means that, remember, as part of iteration 2, we expect you to use pylint on your code, which we talked about last week. We also added a coverage RC file, which is so that you can run coverage on your code, so that you can get like full coverage on your code and tests, or at least, whatever's reasonably close to it. We updated the GitLab CI file so that it doesn't just run PyTest, it also runs PyTest. It then reports the coverage of your PyTest, and then it runs pylint for you. Yes, runs pylint for you. The other thing that this does here is this actually sets up a server for you, because like when you write tests, obviously, like as you've seen in the lectures, you have to actually start your server to run the tests on it. So like your like GitLab actually has to start up your server to run your PyTests on it. So that's what that's doing there. And then we've also added a couple of files. We've added this source config file, which is basically, it just contains the port that your it just contains a port that your server runs on. And then we've added two key files here. The first one is your source/server.py. Okay. This is your main function, if you will. Like, this is the server. Like, there is one server that exists in your project, right? And you will have many routes in this server. And you probably see some similar patterns here to the previous one, where it's like your server's running down here, here is a route, and then we have lots of other stuff. All of this stuff that's highlighted here, this default handler, cause, trap, blah, blah, this is all stuff you need to give zero damns about. You do not touch it. You do not change it. You do not worry about it. It's there so that your code can function correctly, and many of you are confused about things, so I'm not going to go into that. Yep. It's actually quite simple. It's like, it's running here. This is your route. You can add more routes. Leave this the hell alone, and then these are some imports that are needed, and you can add more imports if you want. If we have a look at the route, though, you'll see that this echo route, we've modeled it off the original echo route from iteration 1. Because remember, the first echo route, it basically took in a value. It said if the value was echo, raise an input error, else return the value. We've actually done the same thing here, where on echo, we're pulling a data variable from the URL. And if that data is equal to echo, we're raising an error. And then we're returning dumps here. We're just returning the data if not. So I had a question before come from someone, I don't remember, who asked about exceptions. And the way you deal with exceptions in iteration 2, I hope I might have even been smart enough to write this into the README. I hope so. Bugger off. Okay. README, exceptions. No, I didn't explicitly write it in here. But basically, raising exceptions, right, which is the implementation part, raising exceptions, is identical for iteration 2, except that all of your input errors also require this description parameter. So what you would have probably done in like iteration 1 is you probably would have had something like raise input error cannot echo echo, right? That's what you do. You put the string inside the exception. The only difference in iteration 2 is we want you to put this description equals part in front of it. That's just how it works. It's to do with complexities around web servers. But that's the only difference you have to do. Otherwise, you can do the exact same thing. And everything will work fine. In terms of actually testing those exceptions, I'll talk about that in a sec. But you can also see that we've given you this sample test echo file, where, you know, it uses the request library to get the echo URL, it passes in some data, and then it checks here like whether it works or not. There are different ways to test this. But like back to the question, do we run external tests by PyTesting a thing that talks to the server? Well, your PyTest functions will talk to the server. Like this echo test HTTP is talking to the server. And it's a PyTest function. It'll run when you run PyTest. And that's what you're doing. It's quite simple. It's like iteration 1, you were writing tests for functions that took in stuff and spat out stuff. Iteration 2, you're writing tests for web routes that takes in stuff and spits out stuff. There's actually conceptually there's a remarkable similarity between the two once you can like correlate them. Yeah, so that's largely it there. Some other things to probably note for you are that, and this is all explained in the spec, but all of the functions that you wrote in iteration 1 that had like the underscore v1 at the end, all of those routes now say /v2. And the reason for that is because in some cases the actual data types have changed and stuff. It's kind of like a basic method of versioning. So you'll notice that anything that kind of has v2 is basically an iteration 1 function, because we're like looking at the second version of that capability. Whereas anything that says v1 is kind of like introduced. So that's a really quick tip you can use to figure out like what's new and what's old. Now, one thing that I mentioned that I'd loop back to before is you might be thinking, oh my god, do we have to rewrite everything? And the answer is actually no. So everything that you've written in iteration 1, you can actually like wrap. So I have this slide as an example because it's kind of relevant. It's like some of you might have written search in iteration 1, right? Where it takes in something and it does some stuff and it returns some stuff. And the thing is, now that you have this URL that search needs to be, right? Because the search URL might be like /search or something. You don't need to like write all your logic inside the actual route itself. The main purpose of the routes, the main idea of what you'll be writing inside of your server source/server.py is you will be writing just the input and output logic. You weren't meant to write search in iteration 1. I said some people wrote search in iteration 1. So yeah, you're going to be writing the input-output logic. And what I mean by that is, take a look at this example here. See how that this search route, this get search route, what it's doing is it's getting the token and the query string from the URL, right? It's passing it into the search function, and then the search function's returning an object, which this is just dump stringing, right? So this is actually like your server, your source/server.py will include all these routes, but what they're very likely to do is actually go and like call underlying functions. So like, just to give you a visual example here, it's like, here might be your like server.py, you know, and inside this you might have like these tiny little like these little route functions. They're going to be very short, simple functions. And then over here you might have your like, you know, a couple of your, you know, like auth.py, and you might have like channels.py, and like all that's going to happen is that these functions are just going to basically, like your routes are basically just going to call functions you've written in your other files. That's all. And then there's a bunch of functions that you didn't write in iteration 1 that we want you to write in iteration 2, so you'll have to write a lot more now. Which kind of leads to the second point, which is that in iteration 2, because your black box is kind of now the web server, we don't really care how you structure your files. So like, if like there's all these new routes that exist, which you can like read through, and you know, like what's an example, like message send, and there's like a DM and some user stuff and admin stuff, notification. Like you can put these in any file you want. It doesn't really matter. Because we're testing your web server now. We're not testing specific Python files. Praf says, so we have to use int1 function by calling it over.
Yeah, so like you know, a typical thing, like literally go look at this lecture slide because it demonstrates it in a simple way. It's like you're importing your search function from another file and then using it, so that your Flask server is basically just concerned with getting, like, decoding the data from the web and re-encoding it back. You know, this is like it's a wrapper. It's like we call it like a web server wrapper. You know, all of your actual functions and implementation are probably going to be implemented not really understanding that there's a web server that they're being used by. They're just implemented as if they're just functions, and then your web server just uses those functions. The last tip I wanted to share with everyone is that next week we're going to be talking about authentication and authorization, which is this whole topic around token and this whole topic around user sessions. For the next week, for anyone who starts, the only one thing that you'll get blocked on is you'll see that in this iteration, nearly every kind of route here takes in a token instead of a user ID. Remember in iteration 1 how we said that you pass a user ID in? There's a whole topic around what a token is, right? But that's next week. If anyone starts this week, which I'm sure like half of the groups will, my advice to you is very, 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 very simple. Simply pass the user ID in as the token, right? So do the exact same thing you're doing. That's it. Just like when it says token, just treat that as user ID for now. Yeah, don't overthink it. Trust me. Like it's a complicated topic. We're going to talk about it next week. You know, so just leave that for now. And it's you can do all the work. Like you don't need to know that to finish all the work. So there's tons of stuff here. There's also a front end you can run if you'd like to. Here, so you can actually clone this front end. This is actually a front end that you can run. The thing is that it won't work with your code until you do a reasonable amount. So for many groups, I wouldn't worry about the front end for a little bit. The other thing we like to do is we always like to give groups like a live demo of the app somewhere online, which I'll go sort out where that's up to later. But basically, we want to give you like a finished application on the internet that you can actually play around with, because sometimes it's hard to understand what you're actually building if you can't see it. So we try and give you something really tangible so that you're like, oh, this is actually like, I understand what I'm building now. Like it's more than just like some confusing functions. So yeah, that's something we'll be doing. I think that's pretty much all I have to say. Again, I could talk about this for hours, but it's probably better that like I give you all the basics now, and then we can loop back to it next week and keep talking about it next week. Are there any other questions? Any other last questions? Yeah, you can delete the branches after you do the demo with your tutors. So after, I'm sorry. Let me be really clear on this. Don't delete your branches for like another week at least. Just we still have to do some iteration 1 marking. So like, delete them over. What I'll say is delete them over Flex Week. Yeah. Don't delete them like now. Generally it's good to keep them for uni assignment, because like you have like you have some like here's the thing. If you delete your branches, the worst 99% of the time it's going to be fine. The worst case is when you get into disputes about teamwork and your tutor has less to go on and they'll have to guess more about contributions. And yes, there's the Git commit history and that records most stuff. But depending on whether you squash them and depending on like, there's like just stuff to it. We just encourage students not to delete them because it's on that, for that one group of term that really needs them. It's just helpful to have them there. But if you've deleted them, then 99% chance you're going to be fine. Charlie says, are we now putting all the functions in their own folder? I think I saw auth register v1 is now written as auth/register. No. So I think what's important to understand here is that these here are URLs. They're not folders. They're completely different concepts. And I understand why it's easy to conflate them, but they're just totally different. This is just a URL. How you store them in folders is totally up to you. You could store them in 3 levels of folders. You could store them in 2 levels of folders. You could leave them exactly like it is. It doesn't really matter. The point with iteration 2 is that you can store them how you want now. Yeah, if people started deleting other people's branches, usually a team member would start to notice and they'd probably talk to the tutor. So that wouldn't be helpful for anyone. Okay, thank you for the 4 people who filled out the poll. If you can fill out the poll for the Iteration 2 lecture, that would be really great. So that's pretty much the intro to Iteration 2.